Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The cold night air was a liar. It smelled of pine and damp earth, a promise of renewal, but the promise was not for her. From her place at the edge of the great clearing, Bryson Hale watched the mating moon climb the sky, a perfect luminous pearl that felt like a judgment. All around her, the Silver Creek pack pulsed with a single thrumming energy, anticipation. It vibrated through the soles of her worn leather boots, a current she could feel but never truly join. Tonight, destinies would be sealed. Tonight, the moon would sing to the blood of fated mates, and the pack would be made stronger. For everyone else, it was a night of hope. For Bryson, it was the end of a long, silent prayer. Her wolf, a timid whisper in the back of her mind, curled into a tight, shivering ball. It had always been this way, a faint presence where others had a roaring companion. She was an omega, her bloodline thin, her spirit muted. But the moon didn't care about status. The fates, they said, wove threads for everyone. And for 22 years she had clung to the hope that her thread was tied to Taran Keld. He stood near the ceremonial bonfire now, flames dancing in his brilliant blue eyes, gilding the edges of his golden hair. Son of the Alpha, he was the pack's future, its pride. He was power and grace, laughter and fury, and she had loved him from the moment she understood what love was. The pull toward him was an ache in her bones, a certainty that defied her lowly rank. She knew, with the quiet conviction of her soul, that he was hers. He had to be. Tonight the moon would confirm it. Tonight the pack would have no choice but to see it too. The elder raised his arms, his voice a gravelly boom that silenced the excited murmurs. Let the mother moon bear witness. Let her light reveal the bonds that will strengthen us, the unions that will secure our future. Let the fated come forth. A current of electricity shot through the crowd. Pairs began to move forward, hands finding each other as a shimmering silver light bloomed between them, a visible manifestation of their bond. A chorus of joyous howls rose to greet the sky. Bryson's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and hope. Her gaze was locked on Taran. He hadn't moved. He was watching her, his expression unreadable across the flickering firelight. Then he started walking, not to another, but directly toward her. The pack parted for him like a river around a stone. The whispers died. The air grew thick, heavy with expectation. This was it. The world narrowed to the path between them. The scent of him, wild mint and summer storms, filled her senses, intoxicating and familiar. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. She had been right. The fates had not forgotten her. He looked down at her, his handsome face a mask of cold perfection. The silver light of the mating moon seemed to gather around them, waiting to ignite. Bryson held her breath, her storm-gray eyes wide with a plea he couldn't possibly miss. "Bryson Hale," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden, absolute silence. It wasn't the warm, rumbling tone she'd replayed in her dreams. It was flat, hard, a shard of ice. He lifted his hand, and for one heart-stopping second, she thought he would touch her cheek, completing the bond. Instead, he made a sharp, dismissive gesture, a public severing. "I, Taran Keld, son of Alpha Marcus, future Alpha of Silver Creek," he declared, his voice ringing with brutal clarity, "do hereby reject you." The words struck her with physical force. A gasp rippled through the pack. The world tilted, the bonfire's light blurring at the edges of her vision. Rejection was a myth, a cruel story told to pups to frighten them. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. "I reject this bond," Taran continued, his eyes devoid of any emotion but a chilling resolve. I reject this fate. An omega with a silent wolf and a barren bloodline is no mate for an alpha. You are a weakness this pack cannot afford. You are nothing. Nothing. The word echoed in the cavernous space that had just been hollowed out inside her chest. The phantom thread of their bond, the one she had felt her entire life, didn't just fray, it snapped. The pain was excruciating, a blade of pure agony shearing through her soul, leaving a bleeding, ragged wound. Her faint wolf cried out, a sound of pure anguish that no one else could hear, and then it was gone, utterly gone. The space in her mind where it had lived was now a void, cold, silent, and dead. She stared at him, unable to breathe, unable to think. He had not just rejected her, he had unmade her. He had taken the last fragile piece of her identity and crushed it under his heel in front of everyone she had ever known. The expectant faces of her packmates had morphed into masks of pity, scorn, and a cruel, detached curiosity. She was a spectacle, a broken toy. Taryn turned his back on her, a final damning dismissal, and walked back toward the fire, leaving her standing alone in a circle of shame. The mating moon, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a spotlight, illuminating every flaw, every crack in her shattered soul. No one moved toward her. No one offered a comforting touch. To be rejected was to be cursed, unclean. Humiliation burned hotter than the bonfire, a toxic flush that crept up her neck and scorched her cheeks. She had to get away. Putting one foot in front of the other was the hardest thing she had ever done. The pack parted for her again, but this time it felt different. They were not making way for the alpha's mate. They were recoiling from a contagion. Their scents were sharp with disdain and judgment. Her own alpha, Taryn's father, watched her go with eyes of stone, his silent approval of his son's choice a second, heavier blow. She didn't run. She walked, her back straight, her head held high, a desperate final act of defiance against the agony that was threatening to tear her apart. Each step was a lifetime. When she finally reached the edge of the trees, the darkness of the ancient forest swallowed her whole, and only then did the first silent tear trace a path through the grime of her public disgrace. She walked for what felt like hours, with no destination in mind, moving deeper into the woods where the pack's triumphant howls could no longer reach her. The air grew colder, and a low mist began to curl around the trunks of the ancient oaks. She finally collapsed at the base of a great gnarled tree, her legs giving out. The cold, damp earth seeped through her thin dress, but she barely felt it. The only sensation was the gaping, raw wound in her chest where her future used to be. The silence in her head was the most terrifying part. For the first time in her life, she was completely, utterly alone. A storm was gathering, both inside her and out. The wind picked up, rustling the canopy above with a mournful sigh. The moon was obscured by thick, bruised-looking clouds. A twig snapped nearby. Bryson's head shot up, her body instantly rigid with fear. A rogue? A predator drawn by the scent of her distress. Her senses, already dulled by her grief, strained to catch a sound, a scent. There was nothing. The forest had gone preternaturally still. The insects had stopped chirping. The wind held its breath. It was the kind of silence that precedes the arrival of something ancient and powerful. Then, a scent drifted to her on the still air. It was unlike anything she had ever known. It wasn't of their pack, or any pack she could name. It was the smell of ozone after a lightning strike, of cold mountain stone, of winter frost and something dark, like rich, forgotten earth. It was a scent of absolute authority, power. From the deepest shadows between two colossal pines, a figure detached itself from the darkness. He did not step out so much as simply emerge, as if the night itself had given him form. He was tall, impossibly so, and broad-shouldered, clad in dark, unassuming leathers that did nothing to hide the sheer predatory presence he commanded. His hair was the color of a moonless midnight, and as he moved closer, his footsteps made no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Bryson scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough bark of the oak. Her heart, which she thought had shattered, began to pound with a new, primal terror. This was no rogue. This was something else entirely. His face was hard angles and shadows, a study in severity, but his eyes, they were a strange, pale silver, and they seemed to absorb the dim light, holding secrets as old as the mountains. A faint silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only mar on a face that looked as though it were carved from granite. He stopped a dozen paces from her, his unnerving gaze pinning her in place. He looked at her not with pity, but with a calm, assessing intensity that stripped her bare all over again. He saw the rejection clinging to her like a shroud. He saw the void where her wolf had been. She felt as though he could see the very atoms of her soul. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, quiet rumble that vibrated through the ground, through the very air she breathed. It was calm, measured, yet held an undercurrent of such immense power that it made the alpha's boom from earlier sound like a child's shout. He tilted his head slightly, his silver eyes never leaving hers. A glint of metal caught her eye, a heavy signet ring on his right hand, carved with the unmistakable sigil of a snarling wolf beneath a crown, the symbol of the high alpha, the king. They broke you, he stated. It was not a question. It was a simple, brutal observation. Bryson couldn't speak. Her throat was closed tight with unshed tears and terror. She could only stare at the ring, at the living legend who stood before her, Alpha King Iskor Valibrand, a name whispered in fear and awe, the ruler of all the northern territories. A wolf said to be more ancient myth than man. What was he doing here, in her pack's territory? On this night, he took another silent step forward. The boy took your bond, your wolf, your future. He left you with nothing but shame. His gaze flickered over her, and for a fleeting moment, a strange light entered his eyes. Shame is a poison. It can be drunk, or it can be forged into a weapon. He stopped again, close enough now that she could feel the impossible cold that seemed to radiate from him, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation still searing her skin. He held out his hand, not to her, but palm up, as if weighing an invisible choice. So I will ask you once, broken girl of Silver Creek, the Alpha King said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more commanding than any shout. Do you want revenge or freedom? The words hung in the frigid air between them, two impossible paths branching from a single moment of ruin. Revenge, freedom. To Bryson, whose world had shrunk to the size of a wound, they felt like words from a foreign language. Freedom was a ghost. Freedom from what? From the pack that was her only home, however cruel? From the identity she no longer possessed? A wolfless Omega was less than free. She was prey, adrift in a world that would devour her. Freedom was a long, slow death in the wilderness. But revenge, that word was different. It did not promise peace. It did not offer solace. It was a shard of obsidian, black and sharp. And when she thought of it, something flickered in the cold ashes of her heart. A tiny, defiant ember. She saw Terran's face, the beautiful, careless cruelty in his eyes. She heard his voice echoing in the silent forest, branding her with that single, annihilating word. Nothing. Revenge was a fire. It could warm her, it could burn her. Right now, she didn't care which, so long as she could feel something other than the hollow, gnawing agony of his rejection. The Alpha King watched her, his silver eyes patient, as if he had all the time in the world. His stillness was a power in itself, a gravity that bent the space around him. He was not offering her pity. This was a transaction, cold and clear. He saw a tool, perhaps, an opportunity. He was a king, and kings did not act without purpose. Slowly, painfully, Bryson pushed herself up, using the rough bark of the oak to steady her trembling legs. She met his gaze, the first act of true defiance she had managed all night. Her own storm-gray eyes, swollen and red-rimmed, held his. Both, she rasped, the single word tearing at her raw throat. It was an audacious, desperate answer, a demand from a beggar to a god. For a moment, nothing happened. The king's expression did not change. Then, the corner of his mouth tilted in a barely perceptible smirk. It was not a smile of warmth, but of acknowledgement, of satisfaction. Good, he rumbled. the sound a low vibration that seemed to settle her shaking. Freedom without purpose is exile. Revenge without a future is just ash. Both is the only answer with any weight. He took a step closer, and the overwhelming scent of him, winter frost and charged air, made her dizzy. He was so large he blocked out what little light filtered through the canopy. But there is a price. There is always a price. If I give you a new pack, a new name, a new place in this world, where no one can touch you, you will belong to me. Your loyalty, your service, your life. It will be mine to command. Is that understood? Belong to him. The words should have terrified her. She had just been cast off because she belonged to no one, was worth nothing. To belong to the most powerful wolf on the continent. It was a cage of a different kind, but it was also a fortress, a shield. I have nothing else to give, she whispered. The truth of it, a bitter pill. You have your pain, he corrected, his voice devoid of sympathy, yet not cruel. It was a statement of fact. And we will make it your armor. He extended his hand. It was large and calloused, the skin weathered. The silver signet ring with its crowned wolf seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. This was it. The moment her path forked forever, she looked at his hand, then back at the memory of Terran's, making that sharp, cutting gesture of rejection. The ember of rage inside her flared. With a shaking hand, she reached out and placed her small, cold fingers in his palm. The contact was a shock. Not of warmth, but of an impossible, biting cold, like plunging her hand into a snow-fed mountain river. A jolt of pure energy shot up her arm, straight to the hollow place in her chest. It didn't fill the void, but it illuminated its edges, making her gasp. It was a power unlike the warm, earthy thrum of her pack. This was ancient, elemental, and utterly untamed. His fingers closed. Around hers, his grip firm and absolute. It was not a comforting hold, it was a claim. By the fallen moon and the blood that binds, Iskor Valibrand said, his voice low and formal, a vow spoken into the heart of the night. I take you from the ashes of your old life. I claim your debt. You are now of the veil. You are under my protection. You are mine. As he spoke the last word, the ring on his finger burned with a sudden, intense cold against her skin. Something sealed between them, an invisible chain forged in darkness and despair. He released her hand, but the feeling of his power lingered, a phantom current dancing over her skin. Without another word, he turned and began to walk back the way she had come, back toward the clearing, toward the pack, toward Terran. Panic seized her. Wait, where are we going? He glanced back over his shoulder, his silver eyes glinting. You chose revenge. It does not wait until morning. Fear warred with a terrible rising sense of anticipation, to go back there now, to face them. But she would not be alone. She would be walking back into the heart of her humiliation, flanked by the one wolf no alpha dared to challenge. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and followed him. The forest that had been her refuge now felt like a pathway to her reckoning. They moved through the trees in silence, Iskor's silent, predatory grace a stark contrast to her own trembling steps. But with every pace, a strange calm began to settle over her. His presence was a shield, deflecting the worst of her inner turmoil. The raw wound of the rejection was still there, but it was no longer the only thing she could feel. Now there was the tingling echo of his power, and the cold, hard promise of what was to come. The sounds of the pack reached them first. Music, laughter, a celebratory howl. They were celebrating her demise. They were rejoicing that their future alpha was free of his worthless, fated burden. The thought sent another jolt of anger through her, and this time, it was clean and sharp, unburdened by tears. They stopped at the edge of the tree line, concealed by the shadows. The scene was much as she had left it. The bonfire roared, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The pack was dancing, drinking, feasting. And in the center of it all stood Terran. He had a silver goblet in his hand, and a pretty she-wolf with hair like spun gold was hanging on his arm, laughing up at him. He looked happy, unburdened, free. The sight of it should have broken her all over again. Instead, It hardened the last of her sorrow into something cold and solid. Iskor looked down at her. "Are you ready?" he murmured. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He stepped out of the woods. The change was instantaneous. One moment, the clearing was filled with joyous noise. The next, a blanket of absolute silence fell. The music stuttered to a halt. The laughter died in throats. The dancing stopped. One by one, every head turned. Every pair of eyes locked on the impossible figure who had emerged from the darkness. Their sense flooded the air, shock, confusion, and a sudden, sharp spike of primal fear. Alphas, betas, warriors who had never known fear. They all instinctively took a step back. Their own alpha, Marcus Keld, who had been laughing with his son, froze, the color draining from his face. Iskor did not look at them. He simply waited, his powerful presence a silent demand. Then he glanced back into the shadows and held out his hand to her. It was an invitation, a command. This was her moment. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Bryson Hale stepped out of the darkness and into the firelight, moving to stand beside the Alpha King. A collective gasp swept through the pack. It was one thing to see the king. It was another to see him with the rejected Omega, the pack's discarded trash. Terran's smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief, which quickly curdled into a sneer. "Bryson, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice laced with annoyance, as if she were a persistent insect. He took a step forward, puffing out his chest. "You are not welcome here. And you," he said, turning his arrogant gaze on Iskor, "whoever you are trespassing on." He stopped. His eyes had fallen on the ring, on the carved crown. The recognition dawned, and the arrogance in his posture collapsed like a house of cards. He stared, speechless, his face a mask of dawning horror. But it was too late. At that exact moment, as the mating moon reached its zenith directly overhead, pouring its pure silver light down upon them, the world fractured. The pact she had made with Iskor, the claim he had spoken, collided with the ancient magic of the moon. A force, violent and unstoppable, erupted between them. It was nothing like the gentle pull she had felt for Terran. This was a cataclysm, a supernova. An invisible, roaring power slammed into her, an inferno that consumed the last of her grief and filled the void where her wolf had been, not with a wolf, but with the raw, untamed essence of a king. The scent of him, ozone, winter, ancient stone, crashed through her senses, branding itself onto her very soul. It was agony and ecstasy, a terror and a homecoming all at once. Her knees buckled, and she cried out, grabbing onto Iskor's arm to keep from falling. His pale silver eyes blazed, locking with hers, and in their depths, she saw a reflection of her own shock. This, perhaps, he had not expected. Across the clearing, a choked guttural sound was ripped from Terran's throat. He stumbled back, one hand flying to his chest as if he'd been shot. The broken remnants of their faded bond, still clinging to him, were being violently exorcised by the new one, a bond 1,000 times stronger, 1,000 times more profound. He could feel it. The truth, in all its terrible, irreversible glory, ripped through him. He had not just rejected a wolfless Omega. He had rejected the fated mate of the Alpha King. The girl he had called nothing was now bound to the one wolf no one was allowed to challenge. His father, Alpha Marcus, looked between his son and the king, his face ashen with the political and spiritual catastrophe that had just unfolded. Bryson held onto Iskor, the world spinning in a vortex of scent and power, her entire being reorienting itself around this terrifying silent man. And across the fire, Terran Keld, the golden future of the Silver Creek Pack, fell to his knees in the dirt, his handsome face twisted in a mask of pure, soul-shattering disbelief. The bond he had destroyed had just become the chain that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The world was sound and fire and ice. Sound, a high-pitched ringing in Bryson's ears, the frantic thunder of her own heart, the choked gasps of the pack. Fire, the roaring bonfire that seemed to pale in comparison to the white-hot inferno that had just forged a link between her soul and the king's. Ice, the impossible elemental cold of his power, a living glacier that now filled every empty space inside her. She clung to his arm, the hard muscle and leather a singular point of reality in the swirling chaos. Her knuckles were white, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. Through the maelstrom in her senses, she could see them all, frozen like statues in a nightmare. Her pack. They stared with wide, terrified eyes, their sense a toxic cocktail of fear, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening awe. They were not looking at her, not really. They were looking at the man she was clinging to, at the undeniable aura of absolute power that now radiated from him, an aura that had impossibly wrapped itself around her as well. Then her eyes found Taryn. He was still on his knees, his golden hair falling into his face, his broad shoulders shaking. His head was bowed, his hands clenched in the dirt. A low, agonized sound was being torn from his throat, a sound of such profound suffering it cut through the ringing in her ears. Through the tattered, bleeding remnants of their old bond, she could feel a ghost of what he was feeling, a searing, phantom pain, as if his own soul were being branded with another's mark. He was feeling her bond with Iskor. He was experiencing the echo of the king's claim, a spiritual violation that was his eternal punishment for shattering what the fates had given him. He had wanted freedom from her. Now he was chained to the ghost of her new bond forever. It was Iskor who broke the spell. He did not move, did not even shift his weight, but his presence seemed to expand, to press down on the clearing, forcing the world to bend to his will. His gaze lifted from Taryn's pathetic form and settled on Alpha Marcus, Taryn's father. Alpha Keld, Iskor said, his voice a low, calm vibration that cut through the silence. It was not a greeting. It was a summons. Alpha Marcus flinched, as if struck. He was a proud, strong alpha, a warrior who had led their pack for 30 years. Bryson had never seen him display a hint of fear. Now, terror was etched into every line on his face. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands held slightly out from his sides in a gesture of placation. "Your Majesty," he managed, his voice strained. We were not aware of your presence in our lands. Had we known, we would have offered you our hospitality." "I did not come for your hospitality," Iskor stated, his tone flat and cold. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly on Bryson's arm, a silent reminder of possession. "I came for what was discarded." His silver eyes flicked to Taryn, then back to Marcus. The unspoken accusation was deafening. "You allowed this to happen. You watched your heir throw away a gift of the fates, and in doing so, you insulted a power far beyond your comprehension." Alpha Marcus's face went ashen. He understood. This was not about a rejected Omega anymore. This was about a catastrophic insult to the Alpha King. His pack, his family, his entire future was now balanced on a knife's edge. "Your Majesty," Marcus began again, his voice thick with desperation. "My son, he is young, arrogant. He did not know. I did not know. It was a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable—" "It was a choice," Iskor interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, laced with a lethal quiet. "He made his. Now I have made mine." He looked down at Bryson, and for a heartbeat, his expression softened, not with warmth, but with something else. A flicker of possessive assessment, like a dragon surveying a piece of gold it had just added to its hoard. "She is of the Veil now, marked by me, mated by the moon. Your laws, your territory, your pack, they no longer have any claim on her." Each word was a nail in the coffin of her old life. She was being formally, royally excised from Silver Creek. She felt a strange pang, not of loss, but of vertigo. The ground beneath her feet was irrevocably gone. Alpha Marcus bowed his head, a gesture of complete submission. "We surrender any and all claim. Bryson Hale she is free of us. She is yours, Your Majesty, by all laws, old and new." Taryn finally looked up, his brilliant blue eyes wild with a pain that went beyond the spiritual. He was looking at Bryson, truly looking at her for the first time. He wasn't seeing the quiet, plain Omega he had cast aside. He was seeing a woman bathed in the terrifying aura of a king, her storm-gray eyes reflecting the bonfire's light, her hand resting on the arm of a living legend. He was seeing the queen he had thrown away. "No," Taryn whispered, the word a ragged plea. He started to push himself up. "Bryson, the bond. I felt it. It was a mistake. I can fix it. We can—" "Silence," Iskor commanded. He did not raise his voice, but the word hit the clearing with the force of a physical blow. Taryn froze, his mouth half open, the command overriding his own alpha blood. He was a prince, but he was in the presence of a king. Iskor turned his full attention to Taryn, and the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 20 degrees. "You will not speak her name," he said, his voice soft, but carrying an edge of honed steel. "You will not look at her. You had your chance to claim what was yours by fate, and you spat on it. Now you will live with the consequences. Every breath she takes, bound to me, will be a reminder of your failure. Every moment of power she wields under my name will be a testament to your weakness. That is your judgment. Do you understand it, boy?" Taryn couldn't speak. He could only stare, his face a canvas of horror and dawning, eternal regret. He nodded jerkily, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The matter was concluded. Iskor had passed sentence, and there was no appeal. He turned, his movement fluid and decisive, preparing to leave. His hand moved from her arm to the small of her back, a firm, guiding pressure that urged her to move with him. She took a step, then hesitated, her gaze drawn back to the fire, to the faces of the pack. She saw her alpha's shame, the other she-wolf's envy and fear, the warrior's submission. This had been her world. These people, who had scorned her, pitied her, and ultimately stood by and watched her be broken, were the only family she had ever known. And in one night, she had become their terror and their myth. A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, and Bryson shivered, the thin fabric of her dress offering no protection. Without a word, Iskor stopped. He shrugged off the heavy, dark cloak he wore. It was unadorned, made of thick wool and trimmed with what looked like shadow wolf fur, black and dense. The scent of him, that intoxicating, wild scent of winter and stone, clung to it. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was astounding. It was more than just fabric. It felt like a mantle of power, a shield against the world. It fell to her ankles, enveloping her completely. The moment it settled, the stairs of the pack seemed to slide off her. She was no longer exposed. She was hidden. She was protected. She was claimed. The simple gesture was more binding than any vow, more final than any words. "It is done here," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. The sound vibrated through her, a strange comfort in its absolute authority. He began to walk, and this time, she walked with him, the heavy cloak sweeping the ground behind her. They passed the edge of the firelight and plunged back into the deep, waiting darkness of the forest. No one from the pack made a sound. No one moved to stop them. They simply watched as their king took the omega they had discarded and vanished into the night. The sounds of the clearing faded behind them, replaced by the soft crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Bryson walked. Beside him, wrapped in his scent and his power, the new bond between them a living, breathing thing. A silver cord of starlight that pulsed in time with her frantic heartbeat. She risked a glance up at his profile, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. His face was a mask of granite, unreadable and remote. He had saved her. He had given her revenge and a twisted kind of freedom. But as they moved deeper into the shadows of his world, a new chilling question began to form in her mind. He had avenged her. He had claimed her. But what exactly did the Alpha King want with a broken Omega? The price of his protection was her life. She was beginning to understand that the payment had only just begun. The journey was a long, waking dream. They walked for hours, leaving the familiar pine and oak forests of Silver Creek behind, climbing into a harsher, more primal landscape. The ground grew rocky, the trees changing to skeletal firs that clawed at the bruised pre-dawn sky. The air thinned, growing sharp and cold in Bryson's lungs. Iskor moved with an unnerving, tireless grace, never seeming to falter on the treacherous terrain. She followed in his wake, the heavy wool of his cloak a comforting weight. Her world narrowed to the sight of his broad back and the sound of their footsteps crunching on stone. The The silence between them was not empty. It was a living thing, heavy with unspoken history and the raw, new weight of their bond. It was nothing like the gentle hum of destiny she had imagined feeling for Taryn. This bond was a constant, low thrum beneath her skin, a silver wire pulled taut, vibrating with a power that was ancient and utterly indifferent to her comfort. Through it, she could feel him, not his thoughts, not in any clear way, but impressions. A vast, profound stillness, like a frozen lake hiding unfathomable depths. A patience that felt geological in scale. And beneath it all, a tightly coiled core of something that felt like controlled violence, a sleeping volcano. Once, she stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock. Before she could fall, his hand shot out, his grip like iron on her arm, steadying her instantly. The contact was brief, impersonal, but the bond flared between them, a jolt of his pure, elemental energy that made her gasp. He released her as if burned, his silver eyes flashing with an unreadable emotion, before the mask of indifference fell back into place. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply waited for her to regain her footing and then continued on. He was not her protector in any gentle sense. He was her warden, ensuring his new asset arrived intact. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern peaks, they arrived. The Vale of the North was not a place one simply stumbled upon. It was a declaration of power written in stone and ice. A deep fjord-like valley sliced through the heart of the mountains, and at its end, a fortress rose to meet the sky. It wasn't a keep nestled in a valley, it was the valley itself, tamed and weaponized. A colossal structure of black granite rose from the earth, not built upon the mountain, but seemingly grown from its very bones, its towers like shards of obsidian piercing the clouds. A single roaring waterfall cascaded down the cliff face beside it, its spray freezing into intricate patterns on the dark stone. This was not a home. It was a throne. 2 guards, clad in dark gray leather and steel, stood sentinel before a massive gate of iron and wood. They were huge, larger than any warrior in her pack, their faces grim and scarred. As Iskor approached, they did not speak. They simply slammed their fists to their chests in a silent, powerful salute, and pushed the colossal gates open. The sound of the gates grinding shut behind her was one of terrifying finality. She had left the world she knew and entered the heart of a legend. The courtyard was vast and empty, the wind howling a lonely song across the flagstones. More of his wolves stood watch along the battlements, their faces as hard and unyielding as the stone they stood upon. They were all silent, their gazes following her with a predatory curiosity that made the skin on her neck prickle. They were not a pack in the way she understood it. They were an army. Iskor led her across the courtyard and through a set of towering doors into the great hall. The scale of it stole her breath. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above, held up by massive pillars of unadorned stone that disappeared into the shadows. The air was cold, smelling of ancient rock, wood smoke, and something else, the faint metallic scent of old blood. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows, but they did little to warm the oppressive chill. A figure detached itself from the gloom, near a monolithic hearth, where a low fire crackled. It was a she-wolf, tall and lean, with hair the color of iron filings, braided back severely from a face that looked as if it had never known a smile. Her eyes, the color of winter twilight, held no welcome, only a stern, measuring assessment as they swept over Bryson, lingering for a moment on the king's cloak that enveloped her. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice crisp and low. She bowed her head, a gesture of pure, disciplined respect. "Your return was not expected." "Plans change, Danica," Iskor replied, his tone unchanging. "This is Bryson. She is under my protection. See that she is given quarters, food, and a healer to tend to her." The woman, Danica, finally looked directly at Bryson. Her gaze was sharp, invasive. "The Omega from the south?" The rumors travel fast. Her scent was of cold steel and discipline, and there was a distinct undercurrent of suspicion. She clearly did not approve. "She is no longer an Omega of Silver Creek," Iskor stated. a quiet warning in his voice that made Danica's posture stiffen almost imperceptibly. "She is of the Vale. Treat her as such." "Of course, my king." Danica's gaze dropped, but Bryson did not miss the flicker of resentment in her eyes. "This way," she said to Bryson, her tone clipped and devoid of any warmth. Bryson hesitated, looking up at Iskor. He was already turning away, his attention on some unseen matter, as if their transaction was complete, and she was now just another piece of his household to be managed. A wave of desolation, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. She was utterly alone here, a stranger in a land of silent, hostile giants, bound to a king who looked at her as if she were a piece of property. Danica led her from the great hall, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous stone corridors. They passed no one, yet Bryson felt the weight of unseen eyes from every shadowed archway. Whispers seemed to follow them, faint, sibilant sounds that died the moment she tried to focus on them. They were talking about her, the king's new pet, the broken Omega he had dragged back to his lair. The chambers she was brought to were larger than her entire family's cottage back home. A huge bed piled with dark furs dominated one wall, and a fire had been freshly lit in a stone fireplace, its warmth a welcome relief. The furniture was dark, heavy wood, beautifully carved but severe. A single tall window, barred with ornate ironwork, looked out over a sheer drop into the misty valley below. It was luxurious. It was also, unmistakably, a cage. "A bath will be drawn," Danica said from the doorway. "Food will be brought. The healer will attend you. You are not to leave these rooms without my permission." The order was absolute. "Why am I here?" Bryson asked, the question finally breaking free from the fear that had held it captive. Danica turned, her expression one of mild surprise that Bryson had dared to speak. "You are here because the king willed it," she said simply, as if that were the only explanation the world ever required. "He has his reasons. They are not for the likes of us to question." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "A word of advice, Southerner. Our king is not like your soft alphas. He is old, and he carries burdens you cannot imagine. Do not mistake his protection for affection. You are a piece in a game you do not understand. Be useful, be quiet, and you might survive it." With that final, chilling pronouncement, Danica turned and left, the heavy wooden door closing behind her with a definitive thud. The sound of a bolt sliding into place echoed in the sudden silence. Bryson stood in the center of the vast room, the king's heavy cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. "You might survive it." The words chilled her more than the stone walls. Revenge and freedom. He had offered her both, but he had never mentioned survival. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, crashed over her in a wave. She stumbled to the bed, the thick furs soft beneath her trembling body. The bond with Iskor was a constant presence, a low hum in the back of her mind. Through it, she suddenly felt a sharp, icy spike of something. Annoyance? Fury? It was a powerful, violent emotion, tightly controlled but immense, and it was his. It flared for only a second, directed at something or someone far away within the fortress, and then it was gone, suppressed beneath his usual calm. The brief connection left her breathless. He was a tempest locked in a cage of his own making, and she was trapped in the fortress with him. She didn't know how long she lay there before the door opened again. It wasn't a servant with a bath, or the healer. It was Iskor. He filled the doorway, his sheer size seeming to shrink the large room. His silver eyes swept over her, taking in her exhausted form curled on his bed. He said nothing as he crossed the room and stood looking down at her, his shadow falling over her. "The rejection broke the vessel," he said, his voice a low murmur, more to himself than to her. "But the moon has reforged it, stronger, it seems." He reached down, his large calloused hand moving toward her face. She flinched, her heart leaping into her throat, but he didn't touch her face. His fingers gently brushed against the inside of her left wrist. A searing heat, in stark contrast to his usual cold, flared where he touched. She cried out, snatching her hand back. On her skin, where his fingers had been, a faint, intricate pattern was now glowing with a soft silver light. It looked like a network of thorny vines intertwined with a winter moon. a mark that hadn't been there before. "The bond has settled," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He looked from the glowing mark on her wrist to her terrified eyes. "Good," he turned to leave. "Wait," she called out, her voice shaking. "What is this? What do you want from me?" He paused at the door, his back to her. The torchlight from the hall limned his powerful silhouette. For a long moment, he was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, cold, and carried a weight of grim finality that froze the blood in her veins. "The culling moon is in 3 nights," he said. "You need to be strong enough to survive it." "Survive what?" she whispered, a new terrible dread dawning. He turned his head just enough for her to see the hard line of his jaw and the chilling emptiness in his silver eyes. "My curse. My curse." The words lingered in the cold air long after he had gone, twisting into the shadows, wrapping around the stone pillars of her cage. A curse. The whispers she'd heard as a child, dismissive tales of the grim northern king, suddenly took on a terrifying, intimate reality. They said he was unnaturally old, that he had made a pact with dark spirits of the mountains, that his blood ran colder than the winter rivers. They were stories to frighten pups, but Bryson was no longer a pup, and the man who had claimed her was no mere story. The healer came, a quiet older woman with gentle hands and eyes that held a universe of sorrow. She examined the glowing mark on Bryson's wrist, her touch reverent and fearful. She said nothing about it, but her scent was sharp with a kind of pitying awe. She treated Bryson's cuts and bruises from her flight through the forest, gave her a warm, bitter tea that eased the ache in her bones, and left as silently as she had come. Food was brought: roasted meat, hard cheese, dark bread. But Bryson could barely stomach a few bites. Her hunger was a distant secondary ache compared to the gnawing anxiety in her soul. The culling moon. The name itself was a prophecy of violence. What right was this? What did it demand of her? The bond with Iskor was a constant humming wire in her mind, a conduit through which she felt the faint, distant echo of his immense, disciplined power. It gave her no answers, only a persistent sense of his focus, his unyielding control over a vast, internal storm. He was preparing for something, for his curse, and for some reason he needed her. For 2 days she was a ghost in a stone tomb. She paced the confines of her chambers, the luxurious furs and ornate carvings feeling more like a mockery than a comfort. She would stand at the iron-barred window for hours, watching the mist swirl in the valley below, feeling as trapped as the winter clouds. Danica was her only visitor, bringing her meals, her face a mask of stern disapproval. She answered none of Bryson's questions, her silence a wall as impenetrable as the fortress itself. On the second night, a profound restlessness seized her. The bond with Iskor grew agitated, the low hum escalating to a frantic vibration that made her teeth ache. Through it, she could feel a spike of his power, a surge of something raw and untamed that he was fighting to contain. It felt like a pressure building deep within the earth, a prelude to an earthquake. It was a feeling of something ancient and predatory stirring from a long slumber. His curse was getting closer. The need to move, to escape the suffocating confines of her room, became an overwhelming physical imperative. She went to the door, her heart hammering. It was bolted, as always. Desperation clawed at her throat. She rattled the heavy iron handle, a futile, hopeless gesture. "Let me out," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the cold, unforgiving wood. To her astonishment, she heard the sound of the bolt being drawn back. The door swung inward with a low groan. Danica stood there, her severe face illuminated by the torch she held. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a new tension in her posture. "The king summons you," she said, her voice tight. "He is in the underhall. Come." The underhall. The name sent a shiver down Bryson's spine. Danica led her not through the main corridors, but down a winding stone staircase that spiraled deep into the mountain's foundation. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else. Something metallic and feral that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was the scent of a beast's den. They emerged into a vast cavern, larger than the great hall above. The walls were raw, unworked granite, glistening with moisture. The only light came from a single enormous fire pit in the center of the cavern, its flames leaping high and casting flickering, monstrous shadows. And there, standing before the fire, was Iskor. He was not the controlled, impassive king she had seen before. He was stripped to the waist, his leather breeches the only thing he wore. His broad back was a roadmap of scars, old and new, some pale and silvery, others a raw, angry red. But it wasn't the scars that held her captive. It was the power radiating from him. It was a visible aura, a shimmer in the air like heat haze, and the bond between them was screaming, a high-frequency shriek of pure, untamed energy. He was holding onto his control by a thread, and she could feel the strain of it, a monumental effort of will that made the very stones seem to vibrate. He turned slowly to face her. His silver eyes were no longer calm pools. They were blazing furnaces, the pupils dilated, the irises glowing with a feral inner light. Black jagged lines, like veins of shadow, were creeping up his neck from his chest, pulsing with a faint, dark energy. The curse was manifesting. "You came," he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl that was more animal than man. Bryson couldn't speak. She could only stare at the raw, terrifying power he was barely containing. Danica had retreated to the shadows by the entrance, her hand resting on the hilt of a short sword at her belt. "What is happening to you?" Bryson finally managed to whisper. A humorless, predatory smile touched his lips. "An old debt coming due. My bloodline was forged in a pact with the first winter, the heart of the mountain. It gave us our strength, our longevity, but the mountain is a hungry god. It demands a price, a culling." His gaze burned into her. "On the night of the culling moon, the beast inside is allowed its hunt. It is a necessary release, a balancing of the scales. The feral scent in the air was his. The beast was him. Why am I here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want me to do?" "The bond," he grunted, taking a step toward her. His muscles were corded with tension, the dark veins on his skin pulsing faster. "It is new, untested. The healers say a fated bond, forged by the moon itself, acts as an anchor, that your spirit might be able to tether me, keep the man from being completely consumed by the monster." An anchor. That's what she was to him. Not a mate, not a queen. A tool. A chain to hold back his own personal demon. "And if it doesn't work?" she breathed, the terrifying reality of her situation crashing down on her. She was locked in a cave with a monster about to be unleashed. His silver eyes held hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond power and control. It was a deep, soul-weary resignation. "Then you will be its first kill." The blunt, brutal honesty of his words was more terrifying than any threat. This wasn't a test he was certain of passing. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble, and her life was the wager. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. But beneath it, the ember of rage that Taryn had ignited flickered once more. She had been called weak, useless, a burden. This terrifying king, this living legend, was admitting that he needed her strength, whatever fragile bit of it she possessed. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Stay close," he growled, the words becoming more difficult, as if his throat were changing shape. "Hold on to the bond. Do not let go, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear." He took another staggering step, a deep guttural roar tearing from his chest. His body began to contort. The sound of bones cracking and shifting filled the cavern, a horrifying, wet, snapping noise. The black veins spread like wildfire across his skin, covering his torso, his arms, his face twisted in an agony that was beyond human, his features elongating, his teeth sharpening into fangs. Bryson wanted to scream, to run, to claw her way back up the stairs. But she was frozen in place, not just by fear, but by the bond. It was a raging river now, threatening to sweep her away. She could feel his agony, his fight, the sheer screaming force of his will battling the primal transformation. She was no longer just an observer, she was a participant in his torment. He fell to his knees, his head thrown back, a howl of pure, untamed fury echoing off the cavern walls. Fur, black as polished jet, sprouted from his skin. His form swelled, muscles bunching and tearing, reshaping into something massive. Something not quite wolf, not quite man, but a nightmare fusion of both. It was a creature of myth, a being of shadow and rage, its eyes burning with the cold silver fire of a winter moon. The king was gone. The beast was here. It rose to its full, towering height, easily 10 feet tall, a monster of rippling muscle and obsidian fur. It turned its head, its blazing silver eyes fixing on her. A low, hungry growl rumbled in its deep chest. It took a step toward her, its claws, long and sharp as daggers, scraping against the stone floor. This was it, the moment of truth. Danica was a statue in the shadows, her face grim, her sword still sheathed. This was Breeson's fight. Hold on to the bond. Closing her eyes, Breeson ignored the terrifying sight before her and focused inward. She reached for the silver cord that connected them, the spiritual link the moon had forged. It was vibrating with the beast's raw, chaotic hunger. It wanted to hunt, to kill, to rend and tear. It wanted her. She poured every ounce of her own will, her own pain, her own desperate need to survive into that bond. She didn't try to fight the beast's rage. That would be like trying to stop a tidal wave with her bare hands. Instead, she wrapped her consciousness around the thrumming cord and held on, making herself a fixed point in its storm. She thought of his face in the forest, the calm authority in his voice. She pictured the king, the man, the consciousness buried deep within the monster. Iskor, she thought, pushing his name down the bond like a prayer, a plea. I am here. Hold on. The beast paused its advance. It tilted its massive head, a flicker of confusion in its glowing eyes. A low whine escaped its throat, a sound of conflict. The man was still in there. He was fighting. It took another step, its snarl returning, the primal hunger overriding the momentary confusion. It lowered its head, preparing to charge. Bryson's eyes snapped open. The mark on her wrist, the thorny, moonlit brand he had given her, began to glow with a brilliant silver light. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct, she held her hand out toward the beast. No, she commanded, her voice ringing out with an authority she didn't know she possessed. The light from her wrist flared, and a wave of pure, calming energy shot down the bond. It wasn't a command the beast understood through words, but through the soul-deep connection they shared. It struck the creature's rage, like a cool cloth on a fevered brow. The beast staggered back, shaking its massive head. It let out a roar, but this one was different. It was laced with frustration, with the agony of the man inside fighting his way back from the brink. It looked from her outstretched hand to its own clawed ones, as if seeing them for the first time. It was working. She was working. She was the anchor. Slowly, painfully, the transformation began to reverse. The horrifying sounds of shifting bone and tearing muscle filled the cavern once more. The beast collapsed, shrinking, the fur receding, the monstrous form giving way to the man. Finally, Iskor lay naked and trembling on the cold stone floor, the last of the black veins fading from his skin. He was covered in sweat, his breathing ragged, his body spasming with the aftershocks of the change. But he was himself. The king had returned. He pushed himself onto one elbow, his silver eyes now clear and sane, finding hers across the firelit space. They were filled with a profound, weary astonishment. You held, he rasped, his voice raw. Bryson lowered her hand, her entire body shaking with reaction. Tears of terror and relief streamed down her face. She had faced the monster and survived. She had saved him. She had saved herself. Danica finally moved, striding forward and dropping a heavy fur cloak over the king's shaking form. Her stern face was etched with a grudging, undeniable respect as she looked at Bryson. Iskor struggled to sit up, wrapping the cloak around himself. He looked at Bryson, truly looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, the mask was completely gone. She saw not the king, not the beast, but the man, ancient, burdened, and utterly, achingly alone. The mark, he said, his voice gaining strength. It's more than a brand. It is a key, my beast. It recognized you, as mate. The word hung in the vast, cold cavern, as potent and unbelievable as the beast that had just retreated into the man. Mate. It was the word that had been stolen from her, the destiny Taryn had shattered at her feet. To hear it now from the lips of this ancient cursed king, spoken in the aftermath of such primal horror, felt like a cosmic jest, or perhaps a rebalancing of a scale she never knew existed. Danica froze in the act of helping Iskor to his feet. Her iron composure finally cracked, her head snapping around to stare at Bryson with wide, incredulous eyes. The suspicion and resentment were gone, replaced by a stunning, world-altering awe. The Omega from the south was not just a tool, not just an anchor. She was the fated queen, the one prophesied in whispers, the mate who could soothe the king's curse. Bryson's mind reeled. The bond between them wasn't just a pact born of desperation and revenge. It was the real thing, twisted and forged in fire instead of moonlight, but a true mate bond nonetheless. The moon hadn't made a mistake. It had simply chosen a different, harsher path for her. The connection she'd felt to Taryn had been a pale shadow, a trick of moonlight compared to the raging, elemental storm that tied her to Iskor. The beast hadn't been calmed by her will alone. It had been calmed by the recognition of its other half. Iskor pushed himself the rest of the way up, his legs unsteady. He was weakened, drained by the transformation and the fight to control it. But the sheer force of his presence was undiminished. He took a step toward her, the fur cloak clutched around him, his silver eyes holding hers with a new, raw intensity. "All these years," he murmured, his voice rough with disbelief. "Centuries. I believed the pact had burned that part of me away, that my line was cursed to rule alone, to fight the beast alone, until the end of days." He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin and smell the lingering feral scent of the change. He looked down at the silver mark on her wrist, still pulsing with a soft, residual light. "The fates have a cruel sense of humor. They send me my mate in the form of a broken girl from a backwater pack, on the very night she is cast aside by a fool." A fool. The word resonated with a profound, satisfying finality. Taryn was a fool. He had held a universe in his hands and thrown it away for pride. The last of Bryson's grief for what she had lost, curdled and died, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. Her old life wasn't a tragedy. It was a prologue. "I am not broken," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She met his intense gaze without flinching. For the first time in this cold, dark place, surrounded by stone and shadows, she felt whole. The void Taryn's rejection had carved into her was no longer empty. It was filled with the icy fire of a king's power and the staggering weight of a new destiny. A slow, genuine smile touched Iskor's lips. It transformed his harsh, granite features, chasing away the shadows of centuries, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the crown and the curse. "No," he agreed, his voice a low rumble of wonder. "You are not." A commotion from the tunnel entrance broke the moment. A guard, his face pale and his breathing ragged, stumbled into the cavern. "Your Majesty," he gasped, bowing low. "Forgive the intrusion, but there are riders from the south. They carry the banner of the Silver Creek Pack." Iskor's smile vanished, the mask of the king slamming back into place. His eyes turned to chips of ice. "Alpha Marcus and his son, Your Majesty. They demand an audience. They say they have come to reclaim what was stolen." Reclaim. The audacity of the word was breathtaking. Bryson felt a surge of pure, cold fury. After what they had done, after the public humiliation, the spiritual violence of the rejection, they dared to come here, to his home. They dared to speak of her as a stolen object. Iskor's gaze flickered to Bryson, a silent question in their depths. He was giving her a choice. He could turn them away, have them executed for their insolence, or he could let them face their reckoning. "Let them in," Bryson said, her voice ringing with a cold authority that surprised even herself. "Let them see what a fool's choice has cost him." A grim satisfaction settled on Iskor's face. "Danica," he commanded, "escort our queen to the throne room, clothe her, attend her." He then turned to the guard. "Bring the boy and his father to me, unarmed." The emphasis on queen was not lost on anyone. Danica bowed low, this time with a deep, genuine reverence. "My queen," she said, and the words felt like a coronation. An hour later, Bryson stood on a dais in the great hall. The throne, a massive, unadorned seat carved from a single piece of obsidian, was empty. She stood beside it as Iskor had instructed. She was no longer wearing her tattered dress, but a gown of deep midnight blue wool, so dark it was almost black, that fell in severe, elegant lines to the floor. Danica had braided her soft brown hair, weaving in silver threads that shimmered in the torchlight. On her left wrist, the king's mark, the silver brand of the mate bond, was deliberately left exposed. She was no longer Bryson Hale, the rejected Omega. She was a figure of cold, remote power, a woman remade in the image of the North. The great doors of the hall groaned open. 2 of Iskor's guards marched in, flanking Alpha Marcus and Terran. They looked small and out of place in the vast, intimidating hall. Their fine southern leathers seemed flimsy, their proud postures diminished by the sheer, oppressive scale of the fortress. They had been stripped of their weapons, and their faces were pale with a mixture of fear and defiant pride. Terran's eyes found her immediately. He stopped dead, his jaw dropping. He stared at her, at the gown, at the silver in her hair, at the undeniable aura of power that now clung to her like a cloak. But most of all, he stared at the glowing mark on her wrist. The truth of it, the finality of it, hit him with the force of a physical blow. A low guttural sound of anguish escaped his lips. The chain of regret tightened around his soul. "Bryson," he breathed, taking a step forward. "You will address the queen," a voice like rolling thunder commanded. Iskor entered from a side door, now fully dressed in his dark leathers and the heavy fur cloak. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, his presence filling the hall, pressing down on the 2 Southerners until they seemed to shrink. He did not go to the throne. Instead, he came to stand beside Bryson on the dais, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration for all to see. She is mine. We are one. The bond flared between them, a current of shared strength. She could feel his cold fury, a tightly leashed storm held in check by his iron will. She drew on it, letting it fortify her own resolve. Alpha Marcus, ever the politician, recovered first. He bowed, a stiff, formal gesture. "Your Majesty, my queen, we have come. There has been a grave misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding, Alpha Keld," Iskor said, his voice dangerously soft. "Your son made a choice. He rejected his fated mate in a public ritual. He broke a sacred bond and cast her out. Those are facts, are they not?" "He was deceived," Marcus insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "We did not know who she was destined for. Had we known? Had we any idea of your claim?" "My claim is irrelevant," Iskor cut in, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He was not rejecting my mate. He was rejecting his. The fates gave him a gift, and he trampled it in the dirt because he deemed it unworthy of his ambition. He broke their laws, not mine. My involvement is merely the consequence. He turned his glacial silver gaze on Terran, who was still staring at Bryson, his handsome face a mask of torment. "Tell me, boy, why have you come? Did you truly believe you could walk into my hall and reclaim what you threw away? Did you think I would simply hand her back to you?" Terran finally tore his gaze from Bryson and looked at the king. "She is my mate," he choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The bond. It was ours first. I can fix it. I will spend my life making amends. I will worship her. I will—" "You will do nothing," Bryson said, her own voice cutting through his desperate pleas. It was calm, clear, and colder than the stone beneath her feet. Terran flinched as if she had struck him. He looked at her, his blue eyes begging. "Bryson, please, I love you. I was a fool. An arrogant, blind fool. I see that now. Don't let him do this to us." The plea that would once have shattered her heart now left it completely unmoved. She looked at this golden prince, this boy who had held her entire world in his hands and crushed it without a second thought, and she felt nothing. Not love, not hate. Only a vast, empty distance. "You don't love me," she stated, The truth of it simple and absolute. You love the idea of what I am now, the queen, the mate of a king. You don't want me. You want the power and status I represent. The Omega you cast aside was not good enough for you. You said it yourself. I was a weakness. I was nothing. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the core of his shallow pride. That is not true, he cried, desperation making his voice crack. Isn't it? Iskor rumbled beside her, his hand tightening on her back. You had your chance to choose her when she was just a girl who loved you. You chose power. Now she has power, and you want her back. You are not a lover. You are a thief, trying to steal back what you willingly discarded. Iskor stepped forward, descending the 2 steps of the dais to stand directly in front of Taryn. He was a full head taller, his presence utterly overwhelming. You will leave my lands, you will return to your pack, and you will tell them what happened here. You will tell them that the Omega you named Nothing is now the Queen of the North, and you will live every day of your life knowing that your soul is tethered to the bond she shares with me. You will feel my claim on her until your dying breath. That is my judgment, and it is my mercy, because if you ever dare to speak her name again, I will not be so generous. The finality in his tone was absolute. Taryn crumpled, not to his knees this time, but inward, his entire being collapsing under the weight of his eternal punishment. Alpha Marcus grabbed his son's arm, his face a mask of bitter defeat, and pulled him toward the doors. Just before they left, Taryn looked back one last time, his eyes locking with Breeson's. They were filled with a lifetime of regret, a haunting promise of the ghost that would forever walk beside him. Then the great doors slammed shut, and they were gone. Silence descended on the great hall. It was just the 2 of them now, standing in the vast, torchlit space. The reckoning was over. Her past had been severed, burned away in the fire of this new reality. Iskor turned and walked back up to the dais. He stopped before her, his silver eyes searching her face. The fury was gone, replaced by a quiet, questioning intensity. He is gone, he said. His power over you is broken. It was broken the moment you found me in the woods, she replied softly. He reached out, his hand gently, cupping her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. The bond between them hummed, a soft, contented song of rightness, of homecoming. It was still terrifying in its intensity, but it was no longer a storm. It was a deep, powerful ocean, and she was no longer drowning in it. She was learning how to breathe its air. They will call you the Ash Queen, he murmured, his eyes holding hers, risen from the ashes of a broken bond to take a throne of stone. I don't want a throne, she whispered, the truth of it surprising her. It is yours nonetheless, he said. As am I. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, profound recognition. It tasted of winter and stone, of ancient vows and new beginnings. It was a seal on a pact made in darkness, a promise of a future she never could have imagined. In his kiss, she was not claimed. She was found. 5 winters had passed since the southern alphas had fled the Vale. 5 winters of learning the harsh, beautiful music of the north. Brighton stood on the high battlements of the fortress, a heavy cloak of white wolf fur pulled tight against the biting wind. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless canopy of indigo, littered with the sharp diamond dust of a million stars. Below, the valley was blanketed in pristine snow, the moonlight turning the frozen waterfall into a cascading sculpture of silver. The air was so cold it felt clean, scouring the lungs with every breath, and she had never felt more at home. The title they had given her, the Ash Queen, had stuck. Whispers of her story had traveled on the wind to every pack on the continent. The tale of the rejected Omega who had become the fated mate of the Alpha King was now a legend. A cautionary tale for arrogant young alphas, and a beacon of hope for the overlooked and the discarded. She had not asked for the name, but she wore it as she wore her crown, with a quiet, unyielding strength that had been forged, not born. A heavy arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a wall of solid warmth. The familiar, intoxicating scent of winter frost, ancient stone, and Iskor filled her senses. and a contented sigh escaped her lips. She leaned her head back against his chest, his chin coming to rest atop her head. The mate bond between them was no longer a storm or a raging river. It was a vast, peaceful sea, deep and eternal, the currents of their souls mingling as one. "You are thinking so loudly I can hear it over the wind," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration against her back. "I was just thinking about the stars," she replied, her gaze sweeping across the glittering heavens. "They look different here, sharper, closer." "That is because there is nothing between you and the sky," he said. "No lies, no city lights, no false warmth, only the cold, hard truth of things." It was an apt description of her life now, her past in silver. Creek felt like a half-forgotten dream, a story about a different girl in a different world. There was a painful clarity to her existence here. The North was a harsh land, and its people were forged from the same granite as their mountains. They were silent, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. Earning their respect had not been easy. Danica, now her most trusted friend and captain of her guard, had once told her that Northerners did not give their loyalty lightly, but once given, it could never be broken. Bryson had earned it not by being a queen, but by being one of them. She had learned their ways, patrolled the borders with their warriors, and sat by their firesides, listening to their ancient stories. She had shown them that her spirit was as resilient as theirs, and she had tamed their king's beast. The calling moon still came every year, a night of tension and fear that gripped the fortress. But it was no longer a horror. It had become a ritual of communion. She would go with him to the underhall, and when the beast emerged, it would greet her not with a snarl of hunger, but with a low whine of recognition. It would bow its great, monstrous head and allow her to place her hand upon its brow. She was its anchor, its mate, the one human scent that meant home. The curse had not been lifted, for the mountain's pact was eternal, but it had been transformed. What was once a night of solitary agony for Iskor was now a shared burden, a reaffirmation of the bond that held them together. "There is word from the south," Iskor said quietly, his voice pulling her from her reverie. Brisson stiffened slightly. News from the south was rare, and it was rarely good. "Silver Creek! Their alpha is dead." She turned in his arms to face him, searching his silver eyes in the moonlight. "Marcus?" Iskor nodded. "His heart, they say. Grief and shame are potent poisons. He never recovered from what his son did." A pang of sorrow, faint and distant, touched her. Marcus Keld had stood by and watched her humiliation, but he had been a strong leader for his pack. His sin was pride in his son, a pride that had blinded him. "And Terran?" she asked, the name feeling strange on her tongue, a relic from another lifetime. Iskor's expression hardened. He is their alpha now, as was his birthright. There was a pause, a darkness that entered his eyes. "The reports say he is a changed man, cold, silent. He has taken no mate, sired no heir. He rules efficiently, but without joy, without warmth. They call him the Ghost Alpha, for he is haunted by a queen he can never have." She could feel a faint echo of it through the ghost of their shattered bond. A constant, dull ache, a perpetual emptiness. Terran was living his judgment. He had gotten the power he craved, the alpha title he had been so desperate to protect from her weakness, and it had turned to ash in his mouth. He was chained to her happiness, forced to feel the echo of her, contentment with another, a daily, hourly torment for which there was no relief. It was a fate crueler than death. "Do you pity him?" Iskor asked, his gaze sharp, analytical. Brisson considered it for a moment, looking out over the silent, snow-covered world. "No," she said finally, the truth of it absolute. "I pity the girl who thought her entire worth was tied to his approval. I pity the woman she might have become, living in his shadow, always feeling like she was not enough. I don't pity him. He is exactly where his choices led him." A slow, satisfied smile touched Iskor's lips. He pulled her closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And you? Are you where your choices have led you, Bryson of the Vale?" She looked up into his ancient silver eyes, eyes that had seen centuries of winter, eyes that held the heart of the mountain and the soul of the beast. But when they looked at her, they held only a fierce, profound love that was as vast and enduring as the stars above them. You were not my choice, she whispered, her hand coming up to rest over his on her cheek. You were my destiny. My choice was to stop running from it. He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, possessive kiss filled with the silent promises of 1,000 more winters to come. The wind howled around them, a wild northern song, but in the circle of his arms she was perfectly still, perfectly safe. She was the Ash Queen, risen from the embers of a broken life. She was the mate of the beast, the anchor for a cursed king. She was the northern star, a fixed point of light in the cold, beautiful darkness. And she was, finally, irrevocably, home.